The time is now 1:01, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Whitney White. I am the Director of Employer Engagement for Talent 2025. My title recently changed, so I almost forgot I was going to give you my old title. But I am the Director of Employer Engagement for Talent 2025. I am also the Diversity Officer for the Talent Innovation Network of West Michigan. So as you can see on this intro slide, there are 3 logos, and that's because this is a collaborative project for Talent 2025, the Talent Innovation Network of West Michigan, and then the Include All initiative, which is one of 5 innovations with TalNet. I know that you may see the chat box and lots of messages there. So we just asked you to insert your name, your title, and your company into the chat box as sort of an introduction for this virtual meeting, an introduction and an icebreaker. Feel free to do that as I go through the intro slides. So I always like to start with logistics. I already shared my name, who I am, what companies I represent, and then a little bit more about the project will come later. But I just want you to know that time is reserved during the session for Q&A. So as questions arise, please utilize the chat feature so that we can ensure that everyone's questions are seen and then answered in a timely manner. I'll also monitor the chat box, and then I will raise those questions to presenters when the time is appropriate. After this meeting, you will receive a follow-up email. That follow-up email will contain a PDF version of this presentation, a temporary link to access a recording of the session in case you have to drop off early or want to share it with others within your organization, a few highlights from the session, and then also a link to complete a brief survey to provide us with feedback. Additional information about our organizations is also available here. The workshop objectives are listed on this slide. So first and foremost, we want to support the professional development of D&I practitioners in West Michigan. We know that there are a variety of resources available on the internet and in print, and we know that there are classes available, training, certification programs, and then also a huge network of people that you could tap into both in West Michigan and beyond. So we want to support the professional development of D&I practitioners. We also want to facilitate discussions and activities that lead to the practical application of the content shared both during this meeting and in the D&I guidebook, which was the framework for this session. We want to amplify the voices of D&I leaders in the region. We also want to create a space where D&I practitioners can network, listen, learn, and grow together. So all that being said, there are a ton of resources available and a network of people who can help you advance in this space. Today's agenda: following the opening remarks, I'll provide an overview of the guidebook. Specifically, we're going to talk about personal characteristics because this is one of 5 workshops. So if you had a chance to skim through the guidebook, you'll know that it's all about the 5 competencies needed to be an effective D&I practitioner. And we're going to do a deeper dive on each of those competencies in this workshop and the ones that follow. At the end of the workshop, we'll have some small group discussions using the breakout room feature. And then we'll share some next steps during the wrap up and close. So as we get started, I do just want to learn more about who's actually in the room today. So we'll launch a quick poll just to ask, are you the designated D&I leader in your organization? The workshops were intended for D&I practitioners and D&I leaders within organizations, but after we sent the invite, we realized that there is a large number of people who are just passionate about learning more about this topic, but then also advancing D&I within their organization or their community. So are you the designated D&I leader in your organization? About 50 people have voted, 40% said yes, and the numbers are changing. So about 38% said yes, you are the D&I practitioner, and then 62% said no. That's okay, we just like to know who's in the room. All right. So as I shared in the meeting notice and then also the Eventbrite language, there is an exciting new resource available, Diversity and Inclusion, the 5 Essential Competencies of an Effective D&I Practitioner. Last year, I spent a lot of time researching, reading publications, white papers, attending webinars, listening to TED Talks on the internet and things like that, just to better understand what are the essential competencies needed to be an effective D&I practitioner. And I published all of my insights in this new resource. But it was not a solo project. I feel like collaboration is key to being successful in many aspects of life, especially professional development. So I leveraged my DNI network that I have here in West Michigan, and there were 15 high-level leaders representing various industry sectors, companies, small, medium, and large, and then also dimensions of diversity who participated in a series of interviews with me, focus groups, and then also revisions of the content before we published anything. So special thank you to my 15 contributors who honestly, the book would not have been the same without this group of leaders. You'll be able to hear from two of them a little bit later in the session for our panel. The purpose of the guidebook is to document the essential competencies, roles, and responsibilities of a DNI practitioner. We really just want to detail what you need to know and be able to do to be effective in your role. We want to combine a bunch of leading practices and put them all in one space so that you don't have to necessarily read 50 different books and attend all of these different programs and certification programs. So documenting everything in one place. This document can be used as a training supplement. It can be a resource that provides those leading practices, and then also a resource list to expand your knowledge and elevate your skills. Because towards the end of that guidebook, there's an appendix that shares a bunch of websites, certification programs, books, publications, research, and things like that. And then they're all segmented by different themes that may be helpful to you in the work that you're doing. In the beginning pages of that guidebook, we talk about how diversity and inclusion is a relatively new field. Even though it's been around for years, it's not as developed as things like medicine, psychology, the sciences, and things like that. So in the guidebook, we talk about how DNI is a practice field and fields evolve in stages. Normally those stages have some very similar concepts. And right now I feel that DNI in West Michigan is more in the number 1 and number 2 stages. So framing with some isolated practice examples and then some really good things happening, but nothing is necessarily standardized across the map. And then also networking, because DNI is a highly networked field of innovators who are coming together, figuring out what works. And that's the reason that we're here today. But with the guidebook and these networking sessions, we want to definitely help move the field of DNI over to the maturation stage and the standardization stages. In the guidebook, we talk a lot about the 5 competencies needed to be an effective DNI practitioner. So there's a graphic over to the left to provide a visual, but then over to the right, there are some definitions. So personal characteristics is what we'll talk about today. But then also 4 other really important competencies are knowledge. So having a foundational understanding of DNI and a commitment to continuous learning. Planning, the ability to envision an ideal future state and develop a plan to achieve it. Leading, the ability to influence people and systems to move organizations forward. And then there is also communication. So the ability to receive and share information in a number of formats with a wide range of audiences. So today, of course, we're going to focus on personal characteristics, but just to give you a high level overview in case you did not have time to check out the guidebook yet. So today we're talking about personal characteristics, and it's really a set of attributes that increase your effectiveness as a DNI practitioner. So it's built around being authentic, curious, determined, resilient, and then also finding value in fostering meaningful relationships. In the guidebook, you'll also notice that for every competency, we framed it as on the left side column. Oh, my mouse is going crazy. I am so sorry. Let me backtrack. My mouse is really sensitive. Sorry about that. Okay, so on the left side, we framed it as an effective DNI leader should be able to, and then there are a list of competency statements. And then on the right side, we talked about practical application in the workforce. So when we talk about personal characteristics, this is on page 24 of the guidebook, an effective DNI practitioner should be self-aware. So that's understanding your own cultural influences, values, identities, triggers, dimensions of diversity, and how you're situated in your organization, the community, and the world overall. And then on the right, there are some practice examples. The second thing is be resilient. So continuously move forward while encountering obstacles and a lack of support. Number 3, be authentic. So offer genuine and trustworthy leadership. Number 4, be a catalyst. Spark or accelerate change within your organization. Number 5, be relationship oriented. Foster meaningful partnerships with colleagues and community stakeholders. So once again, if you have an electronic copy or even a hard copy of the guidebook, all of this information can be found on page 24. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions. We have about 59 participants on the call, so I do encourage you to utilize the chat feature to ask your questions, just to ensure that I see them in a timely manner. I'll give it just a minute for you to think about the information that was presented and for you to type in any questions if you have any. All right, there doesn't appear to be any questions at this time. So what I'll do is ask you all another question. What do you hope to get out of this session? So based on the information that was included in the email invitation or the language that was included in the Eventbrite, or even the overview that I just provided, what do you hope to get out of today's session? Can we expect obstacles? Definitely. There are a lot of obstacles that come with change management, especially diversity and inclusion, because it is a different type of change management that involves a lot of emotions, shifting mindsets, and then often changing behaviors. You should expect obstacles for sure. Curious to how this was concluded. I'm excited for networking. Okay. What else do you hope to get out of the session? Hoping to better equip myself. Strategies, learn more about how to do better, become a better leader and a change agent. Learn and grow, perfect. Have a clear path to change, additional perspectives. Okay, so we are going to allow you all another minute to just continue to enter into the chat box. What do you hope to get out of the session? In addition to it being valuable for me, it's also valuable for the panelists who will present very soon, just so that they can use some of the feedback that you all are providing to shape their answers to the questions that I plan to ask. So this is very helpful. We'll give it like another 30 seconds to see what you hope to get out of the session, and then we'll move on. Improve competencies. Also interested in the West Michigan perspective, how other leaders address their challenges within their organization. Develop as a Dni leader. Add to my professional tool belt. Grow in understanding. These are all really good answers. This is exactly what I was hoping you would want to get out of the session. So, okay. Feel free to continue to enter what you hope to get out of the session into the chat box, but I am going to transition. I'm very excited to share with you that we are joined by Robyn Afrik and Joe Matthews. I've known these leaders for at least 4 years, the entire time I've been with Talent 2025 and maybe before, but they are experienced D&I leaders. They represent different industry sectors. They all have a unique perspective, and they are also contributors to the guidebook. So I invited them here today. They'll share a little bit more about them, who they are as a person and a D&I leader. They'll share a little bit about their experience, why they're passionate about D&I, kind of what motivates them. And then we do have some questions. But we are definitely going to pause for questions and answers from the audience at this time, because we want to make sure that you find value in the session, you get your questions answered, and that it's a valuable experience for you all as well. So now I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn things over to Joe Matthews, who is the Vice President for Purchasing and the Diversity Officer for GENTEX Corp. He'll kick us off with an introduction, and then once Joe is done, he'll turn things over to Robyn, and she'll do her brief introduction. Robyn is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Ottawa County.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate the audience today, and looking forward to a lot of robust discussion as well as questions. Again, as Whitney stated, my name is Joe Matthews. You can see what my title is there. I'll tell you, in terms of the career, I've been in corporate America now about 30 years. 1/3 of my career has been in operations and manufacturing related roles. And the other 2/3 has been in purchasing, supply chain management related roles. It's only the last 3 years I've been inside of diversity, equity, inclusion as a former role perspective. One other question we had just in terms of getting to know me a little bit better is, how did I get started in D&I work? And as I reflect back on my career, it actually started way earlier than I expected. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. Gary's predominantly Black. I went to Rolls-Royce Institute of Technology. When I went to Rolls-Royce, it was an all-male engineering school in Terrell, Indiana. And as a result, it was actually all white males. For the most part, I was the only Black guy in my class as a freshman. There was no sophomores, 3 juniors, and 2 seniors. And so one of the things, at least that I think about what I did, is that I did advocacy in terms of trying to recruit other Black males to Rose-Hulman. So that's probably the beginning of some of my D&I work in terms of just how I advocate for another group that's not present in the room. Professionally extended through my work in terms of supplier diversity. I worked for a company called Delco Electronics, which became part of Delphi, which became part of Aptiv or GM Holdings, depending on how you look at the transitions. This supplier diversity there, as well as my purchasing role, which is included in that. Went to work at Whirlpool Corporation, had several roles there. In fact, I was one of the leaders that did the pre-integration planning when Whirlpool bought Maytag. And supplier diversity is also part of what that happened at that time. I did a little bit extended in terms of consulting, and I've been kind of the lead purchasing operations leader for GENTEX for the last 10 and a half years. At GENTEX, my desire, I guess the desire in terms of how things got further accelerated is that we had a CEO transition. Our founder CEO, Fred Bauer, retired at the end of 2017, and we had a newer CEO, Steve Downing. And Steve, in his first 6 months, I think he wanted to create just a different legacy from what Fred had. And Fred created the good foundation, but Steve wanted to be able to kind of build upon that. And he looked to me because, again, I saw a question like, how did I get to this role? I didn't ask for this role. It was one where it really goes back to my passion. My passion is to unleash human potential, because I believe everybody has the ability to succeed if they're given the opportunity. And so Steve understood that. I mean, he was our CFO before, and he said he wanted somebody on the staff who thought about getting better in this space every single day. And that's something that I bring to the table. So that's how I would say, my D&I work has kind of transitioned throughout the last 3 years. And that's why I'm passionate about D&I. Again, I'll share maybe a story a little bit later, because I'll share a story later that gives you an example of where my mindset is on that. But again, that's still a little about me, and I'm looking forward to more discussion as we go forward. Turn it over to Robyn.
Thanks, Joe. Hello, everybody. Whitney, thank you for inviting myself and Joe to this conversation. It is really great to see some familiar faces online and to see fellow D&I professionals or those looking to do this work in the future. So again, my name is Robyn Afrik. As Whitney said, I am the Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Ottawa County. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Ottawa County, we are the Holland, Zeeland, Grand Haven, Lakeside area, and we're neighbors to Kent. And this office that I'm in now is brand new. It was established in 2018, and I started in the summer of 2019. So in my role, I am to come up with a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for Ottawa County, as well as working with our local municipalities, townships, villages, and cities to look at how we operationalize this work throughout. So not a small task, but I do find that the juncture where I am in my career as it pertains to D&I, it's a sweet spot. So I'm excited for that season of my life. So one of the questions that we were asked to share is, how did we get started in D&I work? And that's an interesting question, because I think it depends on how we define D&I work. When like Joe, as he shared his personal story, I am a West Michigander to some extent. And I will tell you that growing up, the concept of D&I was never talked about. It was just not something that we ever discussed. I don't think I ever understood it from the context that probably most of you are sitting in right now. And being identity-wise, a female of color growing up in a predominantly majority white culture, it just was something that I just accepted and never questioned. And so it was interesting that today we are talking about personal characteristics when it comes to one of the things that is a competency to do this work. And I will tell you that it wasn't until, and I will revert back to the slide that Whitney had put up there. One of the things that we talk about in here is about being self-aware as part of that personal competency or characteristic. I did not have self-awareness. I didn't understand what it meant to be just a woman of color in this context in a conscious way. I may have been feeling things, right, or having experiences that I grew up in this context, but I didn't understand it. I didn't have the words to express it. So it wasn't until much later in my personal journey or my personal life that I started then demonstrating the curiosity of, well, what is this, right? And again, it wasn't something that was brought on to me from an external space. It was more of an internal. Why is this going on? Long story short, that has led me through a path of meeting, talking, questioning things in my life and then external to myself that has brought me to the space I'm in now. One of the things I will say though really quickly is, the other thing was, why are you passionate about D&I? So I've been practicing this work for probably the last decade, and it's been in and out of Michigan. It's also been in and outside of different industries. So like Joe, I've also done this work in corporate. Now I'm in county government. I've done it in faith-based organizations and community. I'm also an author. I'm a professor at Hope College teaching on this. So it's in various places of my life. And what I'm most passionate about, and Joe probably said it well, I have seen lives, businesses, and communities literally transform when you're able to put the D&I lens over the way in which we do things. And maybe we'll get into that in other workshops, but for me, that is huge. And when we miss that part of it, we default back to the things of which I came from. So I'll pause there. Thanks, Whitney.
That was perfect. Really good introduction. So I have some scripted questions that I asked them to kind of prepare and think of in advance. One of my first questions is, based on the personal characteristics competency statements that are on page 24 of the guidebook, which resonated the most with you? And when we were planning this session, Joe Matthews said that I have a video clip that I really want to share that I think would be good for this question. So now I'm going to turn things over to Joe to share a video clip.
Thanks, Whitney. I appreciate that. So Robyn and her husband, Tayo, we're personal friends with them, and they know we're movie buffs, my wife and I. And one of the movies that I think pretty resonates for me in terms of the journey of DEI is The Matrix. So what I want to do is play a scene, the red pill, blue pill scene from The Matrix. And then I'll kind of kick off to some of the things that kind of resonate with me from the personal characteristics. So hopefully I can do this well. I'm hoping everybody can see the screen. All right, I'm gonna push play.
Perfect.
Do you want to know what it is? The matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Follow me.
So that's kind of for me, that's kind of a thought starter, because again, you consider in terms of when you start to work a diversity, equity, inclusion journey, be it as a leader or somebody who wants to support, you have to really become more self-aware of yourself. I mean, just in terms of identities, Robyn spoke about that. Again, I think that's so critical. And the clip from The Matrix actually highlights that. Now, for those who attended the January session, one of the things I talked about was being resilient and the corresponding application in terms of resolve and being determined. The other items that resonate for me are being authentic, selectively vulnerable. Because for me, when people can see through if you're inauthentic in terms of what your passions are. And so a lot of times I use a lot of things from personal experiences to help highlight points. I'll give you a case in point. So, one of the things that I share in terms of unleashing human potential, in December, my mother-in-law passed away from COVID-related complications. We found out December 2nd, and she had passed away by December 11th. My wife has multiple sclerosis. Her older sister has multiple sclerosis. The brunt of the responsibility for cleaning up my mother-in-law's apartment resided on me. And as you know, there's a certain demographic that you kind of keep everything. Well, when we got to my mother-in-law's apartment, there was just a lot of things that needed to be gone through. Unfortunately, nothing was labeled. And this talks about unleashing human potential. So I'll make sure I make this point. This is what I alluded to before. Well, in one bag, there was as we were cleaning out the apartment, there was a white trash bag that had some things in it. And I said, okay, I'm just gonna happen to look in this trash bag. And I found a picture of my wife and her mom when my wife was about, 4 or 5, and her mom was about 24, 25. And it's a picture I've never seen before. Yet it was in a nondescript white trash bag. And what I've shared with people internally is that, that's where unleashing human potential is like. We all are envelopes. Who's going to take the time to open us up and understand what we have inside of us to be able to unleash that potential? And that's where self-awareness comes in. You have to take the time to be able to do that, but also being authentic in terms of sharing that story, so people understand the DNI is not just it's professional, but it's also personal. The other thing I'll share is just kind of being relationship oriented and patient. I don't know if anybody got a chance to see the movie Selma. If you haven't, I would really encourage you to see the movie Selma, because there's one point when Dr. King did not have the group march across the bridge, and just the wisdom, the courage to say no, not now, is huge. And that's kind of where being patient under being relationship oriented. Because again, patience says meet people where they are. It may take longer or for some people to understand DNI, become allies. Again, everybody has a different journey. Again, you look at the Matrix video, it shows, okay, some people want to take the blue pill. Some people want to believe what they want to believe, and you can't help those people. You just can continue to speak the truth that you see that's happening in front of you. However, there are those people that want to take the red pill, but they can't be overwhelmed at once. So you have to kind of meet them where they are and provide them what they need to do, and then they'll move forward slowly but surely. So that's just a couple of things that resonated for me. I have others, but I want to make sure I give Robyn a chance to kind of talk about some of the things that are impactful for her as well.
Perfect. We'll turn things over to Robyn to share a few things that resonated with her and which personal characteristics are impactful in the work that she does. And then there are a few questions that are starting to come in the chat box. I'm sorry. So after Robyn shares, we'll take a few questions from the chat box.
Sure. Thanks, Whitney. Thanks, Joe. So the question again is to provide a real life example of when and or how this competencies was used in the workplace. So I won't use my current workplace. I'll use a different setting, and it would have been in a situation, for example, where doing this Dni work from an organizational standpoint, there were some individuals who came forward as professionals and said, look, we recognize Dni is very important, but we're feeling a little as though our issues are not being heard. And it happened to be in the realm of individuals with disabilities or individuals who also have hidden disabilities. And so practicing in that moment, right? Self-awareness in that very transaction of saying, okay, hold the phone. Here's someone with a very specific perception, whether it was right or wrong. What is the self-awareness of how I'm going to respond to that person in the role that I'm in? And also recognizing that I do not identify as someone who has a disability and or hidden disability, but also knowing that there are individuals who do. And so what we had to do together is communicate in a very authentic way, right? That authenticity is part of that competency, our self-awareness. And me admitting and saying, you know what, I don't know what it's like. And I probably would get it completely wrong. So will you have this conversation with me? And if that's a burden, how can we bring an ally in to help advocate on behalf of this group? Right? So in that piece, we were able then to come up with this catalyst for what should we be doing next, right? There was a catalyzing moment in that conversation, and catalyzing is part of those characteristics or that competency as well. So we had to ask the curiosity question of two parts. One is there's this transaction between people to people as employees, right? How does that relational and cultural piece work? But we also said, you know what's interesting? Let's look at something that's going to also benefit the organization from an ROI standpoint. So we started doing some digging with the relationships that we have cultivated prior to looking at our ADA space and saying from a business perspective, how many claims are being filed, right? And around what kind of issues. And again, we stayed with the whole HIPAA thing. We weren't looking at people's names, but what we were trying to do is get the stats and try to understand, is there something that this group, these individuals in an organization who identify and have advocacy spaces can actually give value? And where are the places that they're not being included? And it has to be from all levels of the organization. So in that space, we looked at the relationships. We were able to catalyze movement from that self-awareness, and we were authentic in that. And I'll tell you something, two big things came out of it. And I will admit the resilience, we had to definitely have that because we met resistance from all levels of the org because, right, their self-awareness was not able to be communicated. What we found is we were able to recognize where the organization was having some major challenges around their claims. In fact, it was probably the second highest in the state. And we realized that through the work of this group, as we catalyzed and moved, we could address preventative measures. So in compliance, right, in an organization, we have compliance where people call hotlines. And we said, that's okay, we still want to promote that, but where can our leaders speak on a platform to talk about these issues to make it permissible and okay? So we actually had someone who literally whose life was changed and saved because this company had never done this before. And in addition, we were able to get a process in place where people who could identify spoke into the whole claims process, and we were able to improve. So that's how I've used this competency in the role that I've been in.
Perfect. Joe, would you add anything to what Robyn said? Robyn, you did a really good job weaving together the competencies, providing a real life example, and then sharing how you came to a solution where everyone benefited. So good job with that.
No, Robyn, I always feel like I'm talking to a master in the space in terms of what Robyn does. She's really good. And the reason I share that is because, again, the diversity officer role is not a job that I sought, but is one I embraced. And And so really, there's a question that I saw in the chat box just in terms of how do you prevent burnout in this work? And I know Dorla had a great response. You really have to practice self-care. You have to find out those things that provides you the relief valve. I mean, one of the things that being self-aware is like, okay, I am an introvert. I do realize it. I mean, when I have things where I have to project this much energy, I will be asleep by 9:30 tonight. I guarantee it. No question about it. And you just have to realize that about yourself is that, okay, what makes sense for you? And that goes to the DEI journey itself as a leader, but also you get the strategy because you can't take something that works for your competitor and apply it to your company. You have to figure out what makes sense for the culture that you exist, but you also have to leverage your own personal strengths as well. Again, one of the things I have is ability for me is the connector. So I always, and this goes back to my days, well, my current days of being in procurement, but also as the VP of purchasing, but also just in terms of building relationships. Relationships provide a lot of great tools for you because at some point you need to take your ideals and get them to others. And the way you do that is that you take the ideal and share it. I mean, as we created the DEI journey here at GENTEX, I talked to Robyn. I talked to a lot of people that you saw inside of the diversity and guidebook to get their thoughts. I talked to Dr. Dni Work at Western Michigan University. I talked to a variety of people. I talked to Jason Reap, the Employer Association, the president there. These are all people available in West Michigan, but it helps to get those informed. I talked to Ken James. And Ken is he's a phenomenal resources in terms of input at Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce as director of inclusion there. So, when I look at the competencies, the other thing I talk about is be a catalyst. And again, Robyn spoke to that a little bit in terms of some of the founding did with the claims. Again, catalyst for me is just really innovative, introduce new concepts, ways of thinking, and strategies. And really, it boils down to what people can experience. I have 3 kids. 2 are off the payroll. 1 is a senior at Grand Valley State University. I'm looking forward to the day when I write my last tuition check for him, which is coming up in the next 2 weeks. And he knows when I stop paying his rent. So he's going to be leaving soon. And the thing that I would share about that is that I'm willing to try new things. Really use stories. Because again, with 3 kids, our kids are 34 months apart. And I know if you had children or grandchildren, nieces and nephews, or you could know that when kids digest food, they gulp it down. If they burp it back up, it smells way worse the second time. So in some cases, you have to go at a pace where, even though you want to go faster, you have to go at a pace where people can digest it. And this is what Dr. Rayanne Booker shared with me. It's like, Joe, you got to go at a pace where you got to make sure you use the data so everybody sees themselves in the data. Everybody should see themselves in data as you reflect demographics and go at a pace where people can digest it. Now, the challenge is, and this is something came from a DI external advisory board member we had. He says, Joe, when you do diversity and inclusion work, there's going to be some people think you're doing too much. There's some people thinking you're not doing enough. And really, it boils down to you and where you are in your company as to how you go about doing that. So again, a lot of the leadership that comes, this is applicable to anything from a change management perspective. I know before Robyn came to her role, her boss and Jim Brooks came and talked to our CEO to get input. Because again, part of her job is both public and corporate, as well as sponsorship in terms of driving the dollars. And Steve Downing said, Joe, he said, I wanted somebody who knew our company because it's going to be a lot harder if somebody comes external to our company to try to drive change. Joe understands who GENTEX is and how we make impact change.
Thank you. I have some thoughts. So with everything you all share, we were talking a lot about the self-awareness and the individual leader perspective, but later in the book, when we talk about leading, planning and leading for your organization, we also talk about the importance of basically understanding the current state of your organization. So some demographic numbers, but then also the mindsets of your workforce and your leaders especially. I want to stay on the topic of being a catalyst because we did have some things that came up in the chat about that. And then also some comments that relate to how everybody is on a different place in their D&I journey and sometimes people struggle to gain buy-in. So one of the questions or statements in the chat, it starts out, I'm wanting to learn how to improve on being a catalyst leader. As a Latina woman, my voice feels minimized in spaces where I am asked to speak up. I need to keep pushing for change and positive impact. So what thoughts or advice would you share on how to be a catalyst when others may tend to minimize your voice? I think it's a really important question because it's also something that I dealt with, being a younger person in corporate America, being a Black woman, just, various dimensions of diversity where I'm generally surrounded by white men as CEOs. That's the primary audience that I work with. So I definitely have experiences too, but I just wonder if maybe Robyn wants to share, being a person of color working in this space.
Well, go ahead, Joe. I know your mic was off. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's just persistence. And what I mean by that is that, I've been the diversity and inclusion officer now in GENTEX really informally 3 years, formally 2.5 years. And this is the first year we actually have some type of workshop that's addressing something that's fundamental in terms of the understanding of DEI. And really what I mean by that, we're launching with a supplier, I'll say the name, Franklin Covey Unconscious Bias Workshop, that's targeted to GENTEX senior leadership. Well, it's not senior leadership right now for the month of March. But it took 3 years for us to get to this point because the ground had to be ready. And really kind of going back to what you said, Whitney, and I have a tendency to go off in my head in terms of tangents. So I want to make sure I stay on point to what you just said. Can you help direct me back to what I was trying to cover?
So I was basically inquiring about a question that was placed in the chat about how we can be better catalysts and leaders, and then especially when your voice feels minimized. Like maybe you're a part of an underrepresented group within your company and others tend to minimize your voice. How do you recommend a person?
So persistence. I mean, knowing that you bring value and persistence and really finding allies. Again, people who are willing to speak in the spaces where you're not present. And part of that is that you get to find allies that are at a different part of their journey. Some of it is exposure. So again, leverage your experiences. And it takes a heavy toll personally to get to kind of realize, okay, when you can do it and when you can't for you, but say, this is how I feel when this happened. One of the things I share as well is like, again, my dad is a cancer survivor. He had lung cancer. And for me, I'm a very personal person, but I use a lot of my personal experience because it helps to illustrate points. I have a younger sister. My mom and sister go on annual women's bowling congress. I mean, they used to go to Reno, Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada. And I realized my dad and I don't do anything together per se. And so I remember we like to fish. Fishing is something that's really important to us as a family, as well as for he and I to kind of have bond time. And I remember looking at resorts in Tennessee, looking to see if I saw people who looked like me. Looking to see if and in particular, when we went to Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, we felt welcomed. I mean, again, if we saw a Confederate flag, I would say we wouldn't feel welcome and we wouldn't stay there. And so I've leveraged that same experience when I talk internally in terms of the company. See, it may represent your history, but if it represents the oppression of my ancestors, I'm not interested. Because again, life's too short to be where you're not welcome. And so with that being said, that requires courage for me to say that, not knowing how people are going to be impacted by it, but that is my experience and I want to use it to positively influence others. So again, I think Vanessa Gutierrez said, how do I leverage my experiences? So you do have to, there is a cost to this in terms of the courage you have to speak up and realize that if your voice gets minimized, you have to keep trying. And at some point you realize, okay, I have to cross a bridge where I cannot stay in this environment. And that's something that's fine. That's a personal call you have to make. I mean, I'm very direct in terms of how I give feedback about these situations, but it's something that you have to kind of gauge. So I would say, don't realize the value you bring, be persistent, and then just know how people feel about different things, and just find that avenue where you can make the connection, but also make the point.
Robyn, would you add anything?
Was this Vanessa that asked this question? Sorry.
Yes, in the chat box.
Oh, Vanessa, hi.
Originally came from Vanessa in the chat box.
I mean, okay, Vanessa, you know me, so I'm going to just answer it the way I would if I were having a conversation with you like we do, right? So my question to you would be, first of all, define what it is that you're catalyzing, right? If you can define that well, and then you have to also understand to what end are you trying to do the catalyzing, right? To what end? What do you want to get out of that? And then when Joe does talk about persistence, I totally agree with that. But I also think that it's really important to understand, as you're persistent in your trying, what are the different platforms and the ways that you can exercise self-care in that space as well. It's a dual thing. And I know that that's a lot that could be unpacked. But again, I go toward approach first, to step back from the situation, right? What is it that you're catalyzing, to what end, right? And then the persistence piece, we got to be strategic around how we're going to do that, because people translate things very differently. So anyway, and to add
I think something important in this space is that if you are in a meeting and you know that a person's voice is being minimized and you know that they're being overlooked and you see microaggressions happening, there's a good opportunity to be an advocate and an ally to that person. Would you all like to speak to being an advocate or an ally? How you can help that person stand up for themselves in a professional, respectful way? How you can amplify that person's voice in the room? Would you like to share anything related to that?
Joe, did you want to say anything on that?
Again, Whitney, you actually did a really good job. I mean, basically, you just readdressed. I mean, one of the things I'm actually in a class right now. I don't know if anybody's taken. I usually show stuff to a long talk about the uncomfortable truth. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that work. Is based by somebody named Kyle Williams, but they give you kind of a framework to how to address these things. And really, one of the frameworks they share, and this is this, you have to have frameworks to be able to kind of talk about difficult subjects. And so in that case, he's like, what do you mean by that? When somebody says something, and then if you're able to kind of, hey, what is I'll just pick one of my kids. What does Daphne think about this? Daphne's been pretty quiet. What does she think about this? And you have to know the person to know if you're calling them out on a spot or they want to do something a little bit different. But the way you do it is just readdress the situation right then and there. Don't let grass grow underneath it, so to speak. Address it right then, and then you're not trying to be disrespectful to anybody, but then also afterwards talk to the person who maybe was slighting somebody. It's like, hey, do you realize that this was going on? And it's like, and I think it's just personal accountability to see something when there's an injustice, even in a corporate setting, you find a way to be able to address it. Because without it being addressed, it's going to continue to I guess, fester and grow.
Okay, so in the chat box, there's a question. Basically, it's about how do you communicate to your organization that D&I work takes time? None of this change happens overnight. So how can you better communicate to your organization? Like, how do you explain to others that progress takes time, that change doesn't happen overnight? I have executed programs, hosted dialogues, and still some people are never happy with the end result. I think that's the reality of doing this work. I know our panelists are probably gathering their thoughts, but I think planning is really important. So later in the guidebook, we talk about how planning is an essential competency, and pretty much it's understanding the current state of your organization, but then also making plans that make sense for where your organization is at. Because if you try to move too quickly, you'll lose your stakeholders and your employees, and it's harder to gain buy-in if you're trying to go from 0 to 100, but they're only ready to go at 5 miles per hour. They're only ready to go at 10 miles per hour. So I think having the big picture strategic plan, like in 5 years, we're going to be here, but we're going to work backwards. So in the next 12 months, this is what we're realistically going to accomplish. And having realistic goals, things that are measurable, things that you're tracking, but then also communicating things out on a consistent basis. So are you talking about your D&I efforts at your leadership team? Do you have any type of newsletter or company email that goes out if you are still convening in person? Are your efforts being published anywhere? Break rooms, notices, little cards? It's the communication that makes sense for your organization based on the industry you're in and kind of the current state with COVID. But having a big picture plan, having a 12-month plan, and then providing consistent updates. Because if you are serious about D&I, if D&I is a priority for your organization, it shouldn't be something you only talk about once a year. Or you shouldn't just do one training and say, oh, we did implicit bias training, check that box, we're done. It's ongoing learning, it's ongoing educational opportunities. It's, providing some financial support for your team members to go to professional development events, get certifications, buy books. Do you have a little library at your office where you can expand your knowledge base on these topics? Go ahead, Robyn.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, and I think too, that's also indicative of potentially the need to revisit definitions and expectations, because typically organizations don't start out by starting something without understanding what the expectation is, what's the deliverable, is everyone on board, right? So I think that there needs to be a regrounding or possibly a recentering around that, and then the agreement to the time frame and the milestone markers at which you're going to demonstrate that you've achieved that. I could be wrong. I don't know, Joe, you probably have more to say on that than me.
No, I think what Whitney and Robyn said is correct. Just communication. So again, I'm going to year 3 of being a diversity officer. The first year, I did all of the heavy lifting. I mean, as we talked about, GENTEX's approach to diversity and inclusion, and the DEI Council, what we decided is that, Joe, you're going to do all the heavy lifting because we want to have a consistent message. Year 2, my goal is like, hey, this is not a Joe Matthews initiative. This is a company initiative. So we have DEI Council videos that talk about what does diversity and inclusion mean. We have videos where we had a DEI Town Hall video where we talked about our accomplishments of what we have. We're planning different communication in terms of our external advisory board members. And as we look at the refreshing our GENTEX foundations, that's when, let's say, the CEO, our CTO, as well as some of the other senior leaders in the company are going to talk about diversity and inclusion as well. The other thing I would tell you is important is that as you do diversity and inclusion work, leverage your marketing communications group. I'm not sure how that looks for people in the various companies, but one of the governance structure we have inside of GENTEX, we have a DI advisory board. That is more executive team. That is our CEO, our CTO, our VP of operations. We have 2 external advisory board members. We also have the head of HR, myself, and somebody who's key on our legal team. That's part of our governance structure. That's the overarching body. Then we also have our DEI Council, which is basically salary employees across multiple functional levels, be it individual contributor, director, or VP. And then we also have our business resource groups. So right now we have 2, and that's GENTEX Vets and Women at GENTEX. And again, this is the recipe we're using inside of GENTEX. It will look different inside your company, but in communication, one of the key areas we see is leveraging our marketing communications team. Again, if you follow GENTEX, our team is very active in terms of LinkedIn, in terms of Instagram, in terms of Facebook. I don't have a Twitter account, so Twitter, I don't know what happens there. But one of the things that you can do is really kind of highlight to the individual employees what's actually happening in the company by leveraging communication. We also have internal newsletter. We have different features that are there. The goal is to make sure we continue to communicate, because again, as many times you communicate it, you need to communicate it again. I mean, and that's just part of change management. You have to continue to communicate where you are and where you're headed and what still needs to be done. Again, this year we have about 5 major initiatives. We don't have 10, we have 5. And we're working through that process from an execution perspective.
There is another question that came up earlier in the chat box where it pretty much leads to, this work is both personal and professional. So how do you balance the 2? With leading D&I, being an authentic, being persistent, finding that balance. How do you balance the 2?
I think for me, I'll speak, and then of course, Robyn will give her perspective as well. Again, I say it's personal because I know, I'll use, this is actually more personal. I know when I was in elementary school, I was the last kid picked for basketball teams. I was the last kid picked for, pickup football. I know what it's like to be on the out group. And that's something that never leaves you. You never forget it. And so even though I do things professionally to help to make us more inclusive, I also know it's personal as well, because I know what it's like to be on the outside looking in. So the goal for me is always to reduce that barrier so people can feel included in where we're headed as a company, but also where we are as individually. I mean, there's a lot of things I do personally that provide mentoring to others. And so again, it depends on what drives you. Again, my goal is to unleash human potential wherever it may exist. That actually feeds me, believe it or not. As an introvert, that feeds me. It gives me energy. It gives me the ability to persist. Also goes with my faith as well, because again, the Savior left the 99 to save the 1. My goal is always to get that 1. I don't know where that person may be, where they may exist, but if I could touch somebody, at least one person, that makes it all better. So.
For all of our attendees on the call, I want to encourage you to continue to place your questions in the chat box. If there are not more questions, then we'll move to the next portion of our agenda. But I do just want to encourage you to use that chat box if there's something that's on your mind. And then while you think about your final questions, I do have another question for the panelists. So what resources, books, websites, trainings, things like that, what can you share with everyone on this call to help them build their knowledge on this specific competency of personal characteristics? I know that earlier Joe shared a couple movie recommendations, but what else can you share with this group to help them build their knowledge and skill set around personal characteristics?
Okay, I'll go because Joe's staying on mute. Okay, so the two that I had specific to personal characteristics, and let me qualify this, it actually falls within the space of, well, let me just say this. It's the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, the NADOHE. So I recognize that not everybody in this room today has everything to do with education. However, what I appreciate is that they were the ones who were able to call out standards of professional practice for CDOs in higher ed. And I know even Whitney, you can attest to this. We even looked at some of this work as well when we were putting this, guidebook together. And it's interesting to see some of the standards, which according to research, right, which is important, how it plays a central administrative role in guiding and facilitating and evaluating some of these processes, which I know was a call out in another question. And then there's, and I will give this to Whitney to send out as well. I know that there is a woman named Theodoria Cook out of the University of Colorado, and she kind of wrote a two-part series on the role of the CDO. And again, CDO can be transferred depending on how you might define it, because there's all kinds of titles out there now. And she named 4 competencies that were crucial to success in this space. And she even delved deeper into the history of CDOs in the US. And what I really find fascinating, right, is to see how CDO work, or what we're seeing now, has been actualized, and then how they're now perceived. So she calls out compliance, strategy, implementation, and diplomacy, which I think there are some competency pieces that transfer really well. But if you're looking at, like, to go in a different direction and kind of research or have this work based on research, which I appreciate in addition, these are just some extra resources.
Joe, would you like to share a few resources? And then after that, we do have a question in the chat box. That's not necessarily related to personal characteristics, but I do want to raise this to the group so that others can weigh in.
No, I think it goes back to just being self-aware where you are and what you don't know. Jason Reep led a class called Uprooting Racism. It was a really good class. It had a book associated with it by Paul Cavill. I read a book by Isabel Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns. Again, I seek data just to help inform my decisions. And so it just depends on what interests you, because you can find a variety of genres to find more information. I mean, you can use YouTube. Again, it's not like you're gonna know everything about diversity and inclusion. You still might be learning things about your own culture that you don't know. So I think the goal is just to figure out, okay, what things can you leverage as you start your own personal journey, but also as you build a journey for whatever organization you find yourself in. And anything that can teach you it helps aid in your journey in terms of self-awareness as well as your personal competency. So again, leadership books are important. Just even studying different languages. My undergraduate degree is electrical engineering. I have a minor in Russian. I study Japanese. I've also studied Spanish. I find every one of those intersections that provided some information for me in terms of learning different terms and how to apply it to my role now.
Thank you, Joe. So I asked the group, do they have any final questions for the panel before we move on to the breakout session? And one of the questions raised is, does anyone have a recommendation on an unconscious bias training that has a global appeal, so broader than race and gender? And then there were some responses that started to come in. So thank you to everyone who has provided recommendations. But I just want to raise that to you as well. Joe, and then others on the call, feel free to, drop your responses in the comment box so that we all can share
Yep.
research here.
For us, at least at GENTEX, we're using Franklin Covey's unconscious bias training. There's a book actually that came out as well. I'll put this in the chat so people can read it. It's called A Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. It's by Pamela Fuller and Mark Murphy.
Okay.
This is a phenomenal guide. Again, it gives you more in-depth. It's like almost like a workbook in terms of unconscious bias. So I'll put it in the chat so people can see this. But it's a great guide to be able to help kind of aid the work. Franklin Covey unconscious bias talks broader than gender and ethnicity. So.
Perfect. Are there any other questions for the panel before we go to breakout rooms? I don't see anything in the chat box. I don't see any hands raised, but I will just advance the slide. So the next portion of the agenda is to pretty much do some reflection on everything you've heard today, some of the comments that were shared, things like that. So reflection and then small group discussions. There's two things that we want you to think about. The first thing is, what is the most meaningful thing you learned today from the panelists? And the second thing is, when reviewing the personal characteristics competencies statements on page 24 of the guidebook, which resonated the most with you and why?